Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? Welcome to another one of our sub-episodes, and obviously, as the title would suggest, we do need to get in the spirit of the season, and we'll talk a little bit about Christmas here in the war, and we'll read an account of a particular event that happened on the Rappahannock River here on Christmas between two sides. But of course, before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about our Patreon content. And we did a reading of Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. So hopefully, if you are not too traumatized from maybe having to read that there in English class from maybe high school, if you want to hear me read it and kind of talk about it a little bit. Our good old friend Ambrose Bierce wrote that, and we did that for December here. We're going to go back to movie reviews. Going to do the Outlaw Josie Wales here coming up. It's been a while since we did Clint Eastwood, so obviously we need to hit that well again, and obviously check another one of our major movies of the Civil War genre off the list. And we'll go back to some memoir reviews as well. So if any of that sounds like it would interest you, there is a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They're greatly appreciated. So, we do have episodes that we've done in our main narrative talking about Christmas and the Civil War, and we talked a lot about firsthand accounts of Christmas in the war and the attitudes that a lot of the individuals had as the war progressed. That was a main theme that we talked about in the narrative, where earlier in the war there was a lot of gung-ho kind of, we'll be home by Christmas, and even though it's Christmas now, right, a little bit, and I'm sure by next Christmas we'll be home, and then it's kind of like going downhill a little bit, and like, man, I really wish I was home for Christmas. And then it's kind of like, all right, well, I kind of wish the war was over. And then you're really down in the dumps by the time you're getting into the next Christmas after that. So it's definitely you see the progression, really. So I do think it is interesting and worthwhile to go through those accounts. And it is interesting too to see kind of the traditions and kind of read through some of these progressions as well in terms of what the soldiers actually get, and whether they're officers or enlisted men. They're either getting some good stuff here in the beginning, and then it's kind of also going downhill as well, where it's like, man, I don't even get rice anymore. It would be nice to even have maybe a little bit more rice than what I used to get. That was one of the accounts that I very much remember reading as well. And I want to, so I do want to read off this particular account because I've also mentioned this before in some of our episodes, whether it's been about Cold Harbor, whether it's been about some of the other situations where we have pickets that are close to each other, where the armies are kind of stationary. There are instances where they will actually kind of interact with each other, talk to each other. And it's actually depicted in the movie Gods and Generals. So if you are a Patreon member, we talked about that movie as well. So we will talk about that here shortly. But this is actually an account from an individual in the 140th Pennsylvania who's going to talk about picketing there on the Rappahannock, where on the other side of the river you have some of Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade. Gentlemen, the chair of the professor of mathematics is vacant in this college. Permit me to introduce to you Captain Fraser. Rah, rah, rah. And away we went and enlisted to go to Richmond. It took us 3 years to get there. No wonder. There were so many long streets to make our way through. So many hills to climb. So many stone walls to batter down. So many pickets to clear out the way. It was a hard road to travel, and the steep and stony one to heaven. I started for Richmond in July 1862, a lad 18 years old, a junior in college, and chafing to be at it. To double quick after John Brown's soul, which, since it did not require a knapsack or 3 days' rations or a canteen or a halt during the night for sleep, was always marching on. On the night before Christmas 1862, I was a dejected young patriot, wishing I hadn't done it, shivering in the open weather a mile back of the Rappahannock, on the reserve picket, and exposed to a wet snowstorm. There was not a stick of wood within 5 miles of us. All cut down, even the roots of trees, and burned up. We lay down on our rubber blankets, pulled our woolen blankets over us, spooned it as close as we could get to steal warmth from our comrades, and tried not to cry. Next morning the snow lay heavy and deep, and the men, when I wakened and looked about me, reminded me of a church graveyard in winter. Fall in for picket duty. There, come, more. McGeese, Paxton, Perrin, Pollock, fall in. We fell in, of course. No breakfast. Chilled to the marrow. Snow a foot deep. We tightened our belts and our empty stomachs, seized our rifles, and marched to the river to take our 6 hours on duty. It was Christmas Day, 1862. And so this is war, my old me said to himself while he paced in the snow his 2 hours on the river brink. And I am out here to shoot that lean, lank, coughing, cadaverous-looking butternut fellow over the river. So this is war. This is being a soldier. This is the genuine article. This is H. Greeley's On to Richmond. Well, I wish he were here in my place, running to keep warm, pounding his arms and breast to make the chilled blood circulate. So this is war, tramping up and down this river, my 50 yards, with wet feet, empty stomach, swollen nose. Alas, when lying under the trees in the college campus last June, war meant to me martial music, gorgeous brigadiers in blue and gold, tall young men in line, shining in brass. War meant to me tumultuous memories of Bunker Hill, Caesar's 10th Legion, the charge of the 600, anything but this. Pshaw, I wish I were home. Let me see, home. God's country. A tear? Yes, it is a tear. What are they doing at home? This is Christmas Day. Home. Well, stockings on the wall. Candy, turkey, fun. Merry Christmas. And the face of the girl left behind. Another tear. Yes, I couldn't help it. I was only 18, and there was such a contrast between Christmas, 1862, on the Rappahannock, and other Christmases. Yes, there was a girl, too. Such sweet eyes, such long lashes, and such a low, tender voice. Come, move quicker. Who goes there? Shift the rifle from one aching shoulder to the other. Hello, Johnny. What are you up to? The river was narrow, but deep and swift. It was a wet cold, not a freezing cold. There was no ice. Too swift for that. Hello, Johnny. What are you coughing so for? Yank, with no overcoat, shoes full of holes, nothing to eat but parched corn and tobacco, and with this derned Yankee snow a foot deep, there's nothing left. Nothing but to get up a cough by way of protesting against this infernal ill treatment of the body. We and Yank all have the cough over here, and there's no saying which will run us to hole first, the cough or your bullets. The snow still fell. The keen wind, raw and fierce, cut to the bone. It was God's worst weather, and God's forlornest, bleakest spot of ground, that Christmas Day of 1862, on the Rappahannock, a half-mile below the town of Fredericksburg. But come, pick up your prostrate pluck, you shivering private. Surely, there is enough dampness around without your adding to it your tears. Let's laugh, boys. Hello, Johnny. Hello yourself, Yank. Merry Christmas, Johnny. Same to you, Yank. Say, Johnny, got anything to trade? Parched corn and tobacco. The size of our Christmas, Yank. All right. Shall have some of our coffee and sugar and pork. Boys, find the boats. Such boats. I see the children sailing them on the small lakes in our Central Park. Some Yankee, desperately hungry for tobacco, invented them for trading with the Johnnies. They are hurried away under the banks of the river for successive relays of pickets. We got out the boats. An old handkerchief answered for a sail. We loaded with them coffee, sugar, pork, and set sail and watched them slowly creep to the other shore. And the Johnnies? To see them crowd the bank and push and scramble to be the first to seize the boats, going into the water and stretching out their long arms. Then, when they pulled the boats ashore and stood at a group over the cargo, and to hear their exclamations, "Hurrah for Hog! Say, that's not roasted rye, but genuine coffee. Smell, you uns. Sugar, too." Then they divided the consignment. They laughed and shouted, "Reckon you uns good to uns this Christmas Day, Yanks." Then they put parched corn, tobacco, ripe persimmons into the boats and sent them back to us. And we chewed the parched corn, smoked real Virginia leaf, ate persimmons, which, if they weren't very filling, at least contracted our stomachs to the size of our Christmas dinner. And so the day passed. We shouted, "Merry Christmas, Johnny." They shouted, "Same to you, Yank." And we forgot the biting wind, the chilling cold. We forgot those men over there were our enemies, whom might be our duty to shoot before evening. We had bridged the river, spanned the bloody chasm. We were brothers, not foes, waving salutations of goodwill in the name of the Babe of Bethlehem on Christmas Day in '62. At the very front of the opposing armies, the Christ child struck a truce for us, broke down the wall of partition, became our peace. We exchanged gifts, we shouted greetings back and forth. We kept Christmas, and our hearts were lighter for it, and our shivering bodies were not quite so cold. So you do have a pretty good account here, and obviously it does kind of harken back to that scene in Gods and Generals. We talked about that, how, you can actually, if you go to the Rappahannock River today, you kind of look at it and you're like, man, like you can kind of walk across. If you're, obviously, we've mentioned this before, when you go to these sites, and if you are, your 19th century field army, you're not necessarily going to be a good time marching across some of these bodies of water, right? But if you're just by yourself, if you're a picket and you're kind of hopping from rock to rock, then you can probably kind of make it at least to the middle. And so if you're making a trade, or if you have a boat, like in this particular instant, you certainly can make a trade here. And obviously, it also kind of highlights a couple other things in terms of how we mentioned that a lot of other accounts are kind of like this, where in the beginning of the war, it's very much we're joining up for this cause, and then a lot of guys who join up are very much enamored with the kind of chivalric kind of way of life of a soldier, and then when they actually start soldiering, then they realize, this isn't really what I signed up for. It's not all what it's cracked out to be, and that's why you have this waning interest even amongst these individuals who, when their enlistments expire, they're not as interested in continuing with the war. And you also get kind of the same idea that I mentioned, where as Christmases are going to continue as the war progresses, you get less and less in terms of the good stuff. But even if you are trading, you're trading what you have. And certainly, if you are a Confederate soldier, then you probably have more tobacco. Kind of goes back to when we were talking about, what's your shirt made of. If you're a Southern soldier, you probably have a cotton shirt, and if you are a Northern soldier, you probably have a wool shirt. So, if you think about it, that sort of makes sense. If you are a Southern soldier, you probably have tobacco. It's probably what you're using to trade. And certainly, if you are a Union soldier, you probably have coffee, right? So if you're able to trade those things, it sounds like it was a pretty fair deal here, if between the pickets here on the Rappahannock. So with that theme, I do also want to read a poem here. This was written by a Confederate soldier sharing his thoughts. This is a Christmas night of '62. The wintry blast goes wailing by, the snow is falling overhead. I hear the lonely sentries tread, and distant watchfires light the sky. Dim forms go flitting through the gloom, the soldiers cluster around the blaze, to talk of other Christmas days, and softly speak of home and home. My saber swinging overhead gleams in the watchful fire's fitful glow, while fiercely drives the blinding snow, and memory leads me to the dead. My thoughts go wandering to and fro, vibrating twixt the now and then. I see the low-browed home again, the old hall wreathed in mistletoe. And sweetly from the far-off years, comes borne the laughter faint and low, the voices of the long ago. My eyes are wet with tender tears. I feel again the mother kiss. I see again the glad surprise that lighted up the tranquil eyes and brimmed them o'er with tears of bliss. As rushing from the old hall door, she fondly clasped her wayward boy, her face all radiant with they joy. She felt to see him home once more. My saber swinging on the bow gleams in the watchfire's fitful glow, while fiercely drives the blinding snow aslant upon my saddened brow. Those cherished faces are all gone, asleep within the quiet graves, where lies the snow and drifting waves, and I am sitting here alone. There's not a comrade here tonight, but I knows that I loved ones far away. On bended knees this night we'll pray, God bring our darling from the fight. But there are none to wish me back, for me no yearning prayers arise. The lips are mute and close the eyes. My home is in the bivouac. And lastly here, I do want to also read this account of Verena Davis is going to give us an account of a Christmas Eve party. About 20 young men and girls gathered around small tables in one of the drawing rooms of the mansion, and cornucopias were begun. The men wrapped the squares of candy, first reading the sentiments printed upon them, such as roses are red, violets blue, sugar sweet, and so are you. If you love me as I love you, no knife can cut our love in two. The fresh young faces, wreathed in smiles, nodded attention to the reading, while with their small deft hands they joined the cornucopias and pasted on the pictures. Where were the silk tops to come from? Trunks of old things were turned out, and snippings of silk, and even of wool and bright colors were found to close the tops. And some of the young people twisted sewing silk into cords with which to draw the bags up. The beauty of these homemade things astonished to us all, for they looked quite custom-made. But when the Sure Enough house was revealed to our longing gaze, the young people clapped their approbation, while Robert, whose sense of dignity did not permit him to smile, stood the impersonation of successful artists and bowed his thanks for our approval. Then the coveted eggnog was passed around in tiny glass cups and pronounced good. Crisp, homemade ginger snaps and snowy lady cake completed the refreshments of our Christmas Eve. The children allowed to sit up and be noisy in their way, as an indulgence took a sip of eggnog out of my cup, and the eldest boy confided to his father, "Now, I just know this is a Christmas." In most of the house in Richmond, these same scenes were enacted, certainly in every one of the homes of the managers of the Episcopalian orphanage. A bowl of eggnog was sent to the servants, and part of everything they coveted of the dainties. At last quiet settled on the household, and the older members of the family began to stuff stockings with molasses candy, red apples, an orange, small whips plated by the family with high-colored crackers, worsted reins knitted at home, paper dolls, teotums made of large horn bottoms, and a match which could spin indefinitely, balls of worsted rags, wound hard and covered with old kid gloves, a pair of pretty woolen gloves for each, either cut of cloth and embroidered on the back, of knitted by some deft hand, out of homespun wool. For the president, there were a pair of riding gloves, exquisitely embroidered on the back, with his monogram in red and white silk, made, as the giver wrote, under the guns of Fortress Monroe, late at night for fear of discovery. There was a hemstitched linen handkerchief with a little sketch, indelible ink in one corner. The children had written him little letters, their grandmother having held their hands, the burthen of which compositions was how they loved their dear father. For one of the intimates of the home, who was greatly loved by whose irritable temper was his prominent failing, there was a pretty cravat, ends of which were embroidered, as was the fashion of the day. The pattern chosen was simple, and onto it was pinned a card with the word amiable to complete the sentence. One of the missing received a present of an illuminated copy of Solomon's Proverbs, found in the same old store from which the pictures came. He studied it from some time and announced, "I've changed my opinion of Solomon. He uttered such unnecessary platitudes. Now why should he have said, 'The foolishness of a fool is his folly'?" On Christmas morning the children awoke early and came in to see their toys. They were followed by the Negro woman, who, one after another, caught us by wishing us a Merry Christmas before we could say it to them, which gave them a right to a gift. Of course, there was a present for everyone, small though it might be, and one who had been born and brought up in a plantation was vocal in her admiration of a gay handkerchief. As she left the room, she ejaculated, "Lord knows, mistress, knows our insides. She was just the very thing I wanted." So I read that one just to kind of give us, for one, I think that the poem was a little bit sad, right? Obviously, we had a little bit of a melancholy kind of approach to Christmas because, again, like I said, things start going downhill, right? Christmas, obviously, for the soldiers at a time, they're not spending it at home when obviously you would have. But I wanted to read this one because I thought it was interesting in the sense that it's not so different than probably a lot of our traditions now, right? Everybody has their own kind of spin on Christmas and what they do, and certainly I'm sure it's not quite the same everywhere, right? But for the most part, I think this kind of sounds similar to what we would do in the modern day, right? You have your stockings and you wake up on Christmas morning, obviously if you celebrate, and it sounds like your kind of normal, pre-commercialized, I guess, sort of holiday, right? So I kind of thought that was interesting to see kind of that parallel. I always think that if you've been listening to this for long enough, it's always kind of interesting to find these parallels. So even in a situation here where it is less, and I think we have in our narrative episodes read how the situation, especially this is 1864 in Richmond, the situation is a little bit different in 1864 in Richmond because there is obviously a Union blockade. The U.S. Navy is doing a good job making sure that there are not goods coming in. There's a shortage in terms of goods, and obviously the civilian populace is really feeling the strain on that. And there are a couple of accounts that you can really read where you can get that for how Christmas is a little bit limited. And they kind of make do with what they have. So certainly you can kind of get that with some of the accounts, even with the First Lady of the Confederacy kind of giving that a little bit of an insight on and kind of some of the things that probably would have been different otherwise had there not been a Union blockade. So you kind of also get that as well. And that also speaks to the effectiveness of the Union blockade as well. So there is something to be said of that. But hopefully you found that we had some of these accounts interesting, whether it was the poem, whether it was Varina Davis, or our Christmas on the Rappahannock here. And I do also want to say happy holidays to everybody listening as well. And hopefully I will catch you on the next one. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Post in the description is a link to the website as well as Patreon information. The feedback is always welcome. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.